After the destruction of Glorious on June 8th, Scharnhorst ended up undergoing repairs in Trondheim. On June 10th, a RAF Coastal Command reconnaissance aircraft spotted the German ships, and on the following day a dozen Hudson bombers dropped 36 227 kg armor-piercing bombs on the Scharnhorst from 4,500 meters, none of which hit their target. Germans shot down 2 of the aircrafts. Then came the turn of the British force, consisting of the battleship Nelson and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, which were 170 miles from Trondheim on June 13th. The 15 Skua bombers that took off were intercepted by German fighters, and British lost 8 planes. The rest broke through to the target, but only one bomb hit Scharnhorst, which moreover did not explode, although it penetrated the upper deck. Repair of the turbines of the middle shaft of Scharnhorst took 10 days. The right shaft could only be repaired in a dry dock, since it was assumed that it was bent and the propeller would touch the hull when rotating. During test on June 18th, at a speed of over 13 knots, such vibration was observed that the only hope was for the 2 shafts and a maximum speed of 24 knots. On June 20th, the ship left for Germany, accompanied by an escort. The next day, the formation near Otsira Island was discovered by aircrafts of the British Coastal Command, and at about 3 p.m., 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers of the Royal Navy launched an attack, which Germans easily repelled with anti-aircraft fire. The British pilots had no practice, and this attack on a large ship was the first in their lives. All the torpedoes went almost parallel to the course of the ship, which had no trouble evading them, shooting down 2 torpedo bombers with anti-aircraft guns. Almost immediately, 4 Hudsons dropped 227 kg bombs from a high altitude with equally great inaccuracy. 2 of the attacking planes were destroyed, 2 returned to base with difficulty, having suffered heavy damage. An hour and a half later, 9 Beauforts armed with 227 kg armor-piercing bombs appeared over the formation, but they were also repelled by anti-aircraft fire and fighters, losing 3 aircrafts. And the last attack was carried out by 6 more Hudsons with the same result. Repulsing the attacks, Scharnhorst fired 900 105mm shells and 3,600 small ones. By evening, air cover consisted of 10 Bf-109, 2 H-111, a Do-18 flying boat, and 2 Arado 196. Germans soon intercepted a British message indicating that large forces of the home fleet were at sea. Scharnhorst was ordered to take refuge in the port of Stavanger. At that moment, some British ships were only 35 miles away. On June 22nd, Scharnhorst left Stavanger for Kiel, where she spent the next 6 months in a floating dock undergoing repairs, often interrupted by British air raids. On November 21st, the ship set out on a trial voyage in the Baltic, but on December 19th, she returned to Kiel to complete repairs for another 4 days. On December 28, 1940, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, under the command of Admiral Lutyens, set out for the North Atlantic for operations against British shipping. A severe storm in the North Sea forced the ships to slow down. Gneisenau suffered serious damage to her hull, where struts and supports had been removed during repairs. Although Scharnhorst was less severely affected by the storm, the ships were forced to turn back. Scharnhorst returned to Gottenhafen and Gneisenau to Kiel. Due to severe storm damage, the commander of the Gneisenau, Captain Otto Fein, demanded that the ship's bow be rebuilt again, which the shipyard specialist completed in record time. Scharnhorst returned to Kiel on January 19th, and 3 days later both ships again, under the command of Lutyens, left Kiel for the Atlantic to execute Operation Berlin. During the passage through the Kattegat and Skagerrak Straits, they were detected by British agents in Denmark, and the home fleet left Scapa Flow on the night of January 26th to block the Iceland-Faroe Island passage. German raiders early detected a large number of ships directly ahead. It was battleships Nelson, Rodney, Repulse, 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers, and Lutyens ordered a change of course. On the turn, the light cruiser Naya detected the German ships from a distance of 5 kilometers. She reported to the command and followed Germans until they disappeared behind the snow charges. Unfortunately for British, the commander of the home fleet, Admiral John Tovey, considered the report to be erroneous and called off the search. After refueling from a tanker east of Jan Mayen Island, Germans turned south and headed at high speed for the Denmark Strait, the gateway to the Atlantic. They entered operational space after 3 a.m. on February 3rd, after successfully passing the last British cruiser patrol. To confuse British even more, Admiral Hipper left Brest on February 1st for her second Atlantic operation to attack a convoys on the Gibraltar-Freetown route. On the morning of February 6th, both the battle cruisers refueled from a tanker and the next day began searching for ships. The pitching was so severe, the storm reached force 10, that on Gneisenau, one of the non-commissioned officers smashed his head on a turret during a sharp list. The ship slowed down to reduce discomfort for the crew and the risk of damage. At 8:35 a.m. on February 8th, Gneisenau spotted the masts of a convoy sailing from Halifax and prepared to attack. Scharnhorst was sent ahead to attack from the north, but at 9:47, her signalman spotted the old dreadnought Remilis, armed with 8 381mm guns, guarding the convoy. Upon learning of the presence of such a powerful escort, Admiral Lutyens called off the attack on the convoy, as he had an order to not engage battleships. Nevertheless, by 9:50, Scharnhorst had close to 23 kilometers with the convoy, attempting to draw off the escorting ships so that Gneisenau could attack the ships left unprotected. But Lutyens issued a direct order to call off these attempts and return Scharnhorst to the flagship. Both ships then headed northwest to the Davis Strait, and after several days of fruitless cruising in that area, they headed south. Stormy weather prevented observation of the sea, and damaged ventilation funnels prevented normal operation in the engine and boiler rooms, and it was simply impossible to be in the open anti-aircraft battery posts. Speed was lowered again to reduce flooding of the bow and superstructures. Only on February 22nd, about 500 miles east of Newfoundland, was discovered the convoy of transports sailing west. Using the onboard aircrafts to search for the scattered prey, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were able to sink 5 ships with a total displacement of 25.8 thousand tons. The former, as a benefit of a flagship, recorded 4, and Scharnhorst recorded only 1 transport. Some of them managed to send a message on the air about the German raiders, forcing them to change their area of operation. Admiral Lutyens transferred operations to the southeast of North Atlantic to interdict the Cape Town-Gibraltar convoy route at a point north of the Cape Verde. Before entering this area, the ships refueled off the Azores on February 27th and 28th. On March 7th, off the coast of Africa, Scharnhorst lookouts spotted the battleship Malaya, armed with 8 381mm guns, and over the horizon, the masts of at least 12 merchant ships. Lutyens again ordered Scharnhorst to withdraw to join the flagship, which was sailing 40 miles behind. To avoid a fight with the battleship, Lutyens decided to go to the tail of the convoy and target it with submarines by sending a radar gun to Berlin. The German Naval Command sent submarines U-124 and U-105 to the convoy, which sank ships worth 28.4 thousand tons during the night of March 7th to 8th. The German raiders were also spotted by a seaplane from one of the escort ships, and the Malaya approached them to within 24 kilometers. The German 283mm guns were already reaching the enemy, but Lutyens did not dare to engage in an artillery duel. He chose the Central Atlantic as the site of further operations. On the way to the refueling point on March 9th, the raiders sank the long Greek steamship Marathon with a cargo of coal for Alexandria, which had the misfortune to come across Scharnhorst. On March 12th, the battle cruisers refueled and received the necessary supplies from 2 armed supply ships. That same day, all 4 ships moved north, forming a search line 120 miles wide. 3 days later, they intercepted several tankers, of which Gneisenau sank 1 and captured 3. Scharnhorst sent 2 tankers to the bottom. The raiders continued north, hoping to fight convoys heading to Britain from Halifax. Meanwhile, the British battleships Rodney, Nelson, and the new King George V were waiting for Germans in the northern waters of the Atlantic, counting on the fact that, having exhausted their reserves of autonomy, they would soon be forced to break through for home. On the morning of March 16th, the battle cruisers discovered several more ships that had fallen behind the convoys. Here the raiders had a field day, feasting like foxes in henhouse. Gneisenau sank 6 transports and Scharnhorst 4. But one of the ships managed to radio about the attack, and Rodney and King George headed for the area at full speed. The final encounter was with a small fruit carrier Chilean Reefer, which skillfully avoided Gneisenau's fire and constantly radioed her exact location. Eventually, the transport, having set a smoke screen, turned toward the battle cruisers, firing from her only gun. Such fierce resistance convinced the Germans that they were facing at least an auxiliary cruiser. Therefore, they decided to finish her off from a long distance, firing 73 283mm shells, more than they had spent on sinking the other ships during the entire cruise. In total, on March 15th and 16th, Germans sank or captured 16 ships. The 3 captured ships were sent to Brest under the escort of supply ships. The valiant Chilean Reefer was still fighting when the radar screen of Gneisenau showed the marks of an unidentified large ship. Germans withdrew at high speed in a rain squall. Rodney, which was closing, managed to notice Lutyens' flagship, and at about 9 p.m. even asked with a searchlight, "What ship?" The commander of Gneisenau, Otto Fein, ordered the answer, HMS Emerald. Cruiser Emerald was part of the home fleet and could well have ended up in the North Atlantic. After that, without waiting for a new request, the German ship abruptly put the rudder on board and moved away from the formidable enemy at full speed. The truth was revealed to British just a few minutes later, when the Rodney came across the wreckage of a sinking transport and began to rescue her crew. The ship's captain, after words of gratitude, said, "We were just sunk by Gneisenau." Admiral Lutyens ordered a course for Brest, realizing that the rain around his ships was narrowing and that there were few chances for further success. The German naval staff believed that the continued presence of battle cruisers in the ocean, which had disturbed the hornet's nest of British search groups, would complicate the return to Germany of Admiral Hipper and Admiral Scheer, which were also on the high road in the Atlantic. In addition, they have begun problems with the boilers on Scharnhorst, frequent failures of the superheated tubes. On the evening of March 20th, a swordfish reconnaissance biplane, launched from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, spotted the German ships 700 miles from Brest. Lutyens immediately turned north and held that course until the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, then turned east again. Ark Royal was only 160 miles from the German foes, but the approaching darkness and bad weather made it impossible to launch aircrafts to attack. The following day, a British Coastal Command aircraft spotted both German ships 200 miles from Brest, and on March 22nd they reached the French port safely, eluding pursuit by the home fleet. During the 2-month cruise, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst sank and captured 22 ships with a total tonnage of 115,000 tons. The return of Admiral Scheer can be considered an additional success of the operation. Carried away by the hunt for battle cruisers, British simply missed the lone raider, which slipped home along the same route as into the Atlantic, around Iceland and the British Isles. The next similar operation, called Rheinübung, was undertaken in May. The newest battleship Bismarck, under Admiral Lütjen's flag, and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen took part in it. At this time, the British were on the alert and intercepted the enemy at the exit from the Denmark Strait. In the Battle of May 24th, Bismarck sank Hood and damaged another battleship, Prince of Wales, having spent only 93 380mm shells. But then, the Royal Navy organized a hunt for the assaulter, and in the end, using almost all available forces, it managed to send Bismarck to the bottom. Prince Eugen managed to break through to Brest, where she joined Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau spent the rest of the year at the Brest naval shipyard, which the Germans specially restored after the capture and staffed with workers from the Wilhelmshaven naval shipyard. After the arrival of the German battlecruisers in Brest, the British, fearing their new exit to the ocean, began regular raids on this base using special 227 kg armor-piercing bombs. It is enough to cite the figures. From March 27th to May 7th, aircrafts of the Bomber Command and Coastal Command of Great Britain dropped 1,013 tons of bombs on Brest and laid 201 magnetic mines. The raids were especially massive on the nights of March 31st and April 5th. During the raid, Scharnhorst constantly experienced problems with the superheated tubes of her boilers, and only the dedicated work of the crew allowed major breakdowns to be avoided. In Brest, specialists determined that replacing the tubes would require at least 10 weeks. The cause of the damage turned out to be purely technological. The metal used did not meet the operation temperatures. The repairs, required by both ships, excluded their participation in the operation with Bismarck, which was planned for April but took place in May 1941. But the British did not know about this, and Brest became the main target of their air raids for a long time. It was necessary to cover the ships with camouflage nets, protect the anti-aircraft gun posts with sandbags, and install huge numbers of smoke generators around the base and on the approaches to it to set up a smoke screen. Measures had to be taken against British agents from among the shipyard workers. Nevertheless, both ships received serious damage during their stay in Brest. After Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, there was little chance for surface ships to operate successfully in the Atlantic. In addition, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst and Prince Eugen had undergone major personnel changes, and time was needed for training and exercises before setting out on a long voyage across the Atlantic. All three ships needed to refuel at sea to cross the Denmark Strait to Norway or between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, and almost all of the German supply ships in the Atlantic had already been sunk. Just before the sinking of Bismarck, the British obtained some secret German codes from the sunken U-100, knowledge of which made it possible to sink the bulk of the German supply ships in May and June 1941. In addition, Hitler no longer wanted to risk the large ships in the Atlantic, considering the defense of Norway more important. In view of the increased effectiveness of radar and reconnaissance aircraft, the Naval Command proposed to Hitler that all three heavy ships be returned through the English Channel, the most daring and risky option for a breakout. The German Naval Command foresaw that the northern waters would become the most important theater of operations, especially with the entry of the United States into the war and the increase in the number of convoys to USSR. Repairs to Gneisenau had been completed by that time, and it was dangerous to remain in Brest, where the British raids were becoming more and more fierce and accurate. On December 18th, the ship received shrapnel damage from several bomb hits in the dry dock. On December 23rd, she was alongside the pier for an electronic systems check, and within a week she was brought to full combat readiness. On December 30th, Scharnhorst was almost locked up in the dry dock when a heavy bomb exploded at its gate and capsized a floating crane. A few days later, the camouflage nets stretched over the ship caught fire, but major trouble was avoided. By the end of 1941, preliminary plans to return Gneisenau, Scharnhorst and Prince Eugen to Germany for service in Norway, which Hitler dubbed the Zone of Destiny, were completed. The damage sustained by Gneisenau during the raids on Brest showed that the Luftwaffe was unable to provide reliable air cover for the ships in the base. On January 6, 1942, during another raid, a bomb exploded between the site of Gneisenau and the wall of the dry dock. The fragments pierced the outer plating in some places near the waterline, which led to the flooding of several side compartments. Repairs took 10 days. At a meeting of the highest Naval and Air Force Command at Hitler's headquarters on January 12th, the final decision was made to break through the Brest squadron. During the planning of the operation, which was named Cerberus, all precautions were taken and disinformation about the possible movements of the ship was disseminated. At the end of the month, the appointed commander of the operation received a detailed breakthrough plan. On the evening of January 26th, Gneisenau went to sea for mechanical testing and gunnery exercises, and a few days later she was fully prepared for the English Channel crossing. On January 15th, Scharnhorst left the dock, loaded ammunition, and on February 3rd was at sea for 10 hours for testing and gunnery practice. The rest of the preparations for the breakout had to be done in the harbor. Command of this operation was entrusted to Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax, incidentally the first commander of Scharnhorst. 6 destroyers and 42 torpedo boats were involved in the operation. To interact with the Luftwaffe, Ciliax was assigned Air Force Colonel Ebel, who was to direct the fighter operations. Between January 22nd and February 10th, pilots of Luftwaffe fighter units, based in France and the Benelux countries, conducted 8 major exercises with the Kriegsmarine, total 440 sorties. At their disposal were 252 Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters, and about 30 Bf-110 night fighters. General Wolfgang Martin was in charge of electronic warfare. Reconnaissance of the carrier frequencies of coastal raiders and their approximate geographic location was conducted. German transmitters were developed to blind the indicators of enemy raiders. Their basing points were selected and the schedule for their activation was verified, so the enemy should not guess about the operation. Therefore, the transmitters were activated for a short time, and the British had the impression of incomprehensible phenomena in the atmosphere. A number of measures were devised to disinform the enemy. Boxes with cork helmets and barrels of oil were loaded onto the ships, with the inscriptions on the containers for use in the tropics. Postal and laundry services for the crews continued until the very ship's departure. The commander of the German fleet's minesweepers, Rear Admiral Friedrich Rüge, ensured a safe route for the squadron. His ships, minesweepers, having cleared each of their sectors, marked the fairway with buoys and floating lights. But Rüge was unable to mark the clear fairway equally well along its entire length, since the excessive use of buoys from warehouses in France could arouse suspicions. He solved this problem creatively. He sent minesweepers into the English Channel, where they were to act as floating lighthouses. At the same time, the Allies drew up a plan to intercept the German ships. The plan assumed that the German ships would break through at night. Destroyer flotillas were waiting in full combat readiness at Harwich. During the night, as the ships were leaving the base, the British launched an attack with 18 Wellingtons. None of the bombs hit the ships, and the RAF crew did not notice anything unusual in the Brest harbor. At around 11 p.m. on 11th February 1942, the Germans launched one of the most daring operations of the Second World War. The departure of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen was delayed by air raid on Brest for 2 hours, so the ships entered the channel just after midnight. They steamed along the French coast at 27 knots and were joined by a flotilla of destroyers near Cherbourg at 6:30 am. To confuse British raiders, Luftwaffe aircraft circled just above the mast of their ships. The German aircrafts then interfered with British raiders by dropping reflectors made of foil. At 8:50 am, the first group of fighter escorts appeared over the formation. They were Bf-110s. 2 aircrafts, equipped with radio jammers, began a meeting in order to prevent detection of a large group of aircrafts accompanying the ships. When the ships reached the operating zone of British coastal raiders, German coastal jamming stations were also activated. Their action was so effective that some of the British raiders had to be switched off, and the functioning stations began to change operating frequencies in order to avoid the interference. For a long time, the British believed that they were dealing with some unknown atmospheric phenomenon. Around 10 p.m., one of the British raiders switched to such a high frequency that the Germans were unable to interfere with it. It was from this raider that a message was received about German aircrafts flying over the strait at low altitude. When the ships passed the mouth of the Somme, a pair of Spitfires flew over them. The British fighters were returning from a raid in the airspace of northern France. Having discovered large German ships, the pilots nevertheless decided to maintain radio silence, and the British Navy headquarters only learned about the German ships 30 minutes after landing. At 11:45, a signal was received about the German ships passing Boulogne. The ships immediately moved into divisions to intercept. At 12:30, the Germans pulled into the narrowest part of the English Channel. At 12:45, Ciliax was 10 miles from Calais, when his formation was attacked by 6 torpedo aircrafts escorted by 10 fighters. The German fighters were higher and immediately dived to intercept the swordfishes. The pilots of 10 Spitfires managed to shoot down 3 machines. More than 80 anti-aircraft guns on the German ships turned to port to meet the suicidal attack. All 6 aircrafts were shot down. The flagship opened fire on one of the swordfish from a distance of about 1 kilometer. The plane fell into the water about 100 meters from the left side of the ship, but managed to launch a torpedo, which was evaded by a sharp turn. At 1:30 p.m., they passed Cape Grisnez. At 1:45, water fountains rose up on the left side of Scharnhorst. It was the coastal batteries that opened fire very late. Their shells fell harmlessly into the water far from the German ships. The lead destroyer immediately began to lay a smoke screen. A few minutes later, the gunners of the Dover battery ceased firing, as they had lost their target in the smoke and fog. But at 2:30, 30 meters from the left side of Scharnhorst, opposite the Brunner turret, one of the magnetic mines, laid by British aircraft at a depth of 38 meters several days earlier, exploded. Due to damage to fuses, the ship's electrical systems failed, leaving all rooms without lighting for 20 minutes. The mine explosion created a large hole in the area of the Brunner turret. The turret was temporarily jammed, and the main electric motors was seriously damaged. The bow 150mm turret and the single 150mm mount on the left side were also jammed, and the 105mm mount was damaged. Several transformers and some equipment for the fire control system were destroyed. Due to weak foundations, not designed for such impact loads, the bearings of the feed pumps and turbo generators failed, which forced the ship to stop. Almost all turbo generators failed. The aft gyro compass, director, and echo sounder failed for a short time. While Scharnhorst stood motionless, Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax transferred the flag to the destroyer Z-29. 18 minutes after the explosion, the first turbine was started. 6 minutes later the second, and at 3 p.m. the third. which allowed the ship to reach a speed of 27 knots. Soon after, the twin-engine bomber dropped several bombs 90 meters from the left side, which did not cause any damage. A little later, Scharnhorst was attacked by 12 Bofforts for 10 minutes, but they were driven off by anti-aircraft fire and Luftwaffe fighters. Then, a torpedo, dropped by an aircraft from the stern corner, was evaded. There were several more air attacks, but intense anti-aircraft fire and skillful maneuvering brought all the efforts of the British to naught. The barrels of the anti-aircraft guns were red hot, one even exploded, and the horizontal guidance drives of several others jammed. At 2:40 p.m., the escort group was attacked by a squadron of Hurricanes with cannon armament. The destroyer Jaguar and the torpedo boat T-13 were damaged. The British lost 4 aircraft. Gneisenau, Prince Eugen and 5 destroyers, which had gone ahead, were also subjected to air attacks. At 2:45 p.m., 5 twin-engine Whirlwind fighter bombers attempted to attack, but were driven off by German fighters. Over the next 2 hours, fighters and anti-aircraft fire repelled several more air raids. A total of 242 British aircrafts took part in the attacks on the formation, of which only 39 were able to reach their target. Although no large ships were hit, 2 escort ships received shrapnel damage and were forced to seek refuge in bases. At 3:17 p.m., large German ships were detected by the destroyer's radar. At 3:40 p.m., visual contact was established. More by chance than by organization, the attack of the formation coincided in time with the attack of the British torpedo bombers Beaufort, which allowed the destroyers of the 1st Division to approach the target to a distance of 1.6 miles. The destroyer Worcester took the full brunt of the broadsides from Gneisenau and Prince Eugen. Her commander ordered the crew to prepare to abandon ship. Unable to move and fight, Worcester was in a disastrous situation at the moment when the Germans passed by, not paying attention to the burning and sinking ship. The Germans believed that she was doomed. 4 British destroyers took the damaged Worcester under escort and escorted her back to Harwich, being repeatedly attacked by friendly and German bombers. Z-29 also fired at the British destroyers in the last minutes of the battle. One of her own shells exploded before it had time to leave the barrel. Due to the damage, the destroyer lost speed for 20 minutes. Celiax had to transfer to Hermann Schumann. While the commander was transferred with the help of lifeboats, Scharnhorst caught up with the destroyer. At 4:08 p.m., an attack took place in which about 100 Hudson and Beaufort bombers took part. Again, there were no hits on the ships, and the Germans shot down at least 5 aircrafts. At 6 p.m., one of the British torpedo bombers broke through dense anti-aircraft fire, but the torpedo it launched was close to the surface and the ship easily evaded it. As darkness fell, the formation was attacked by Wellington bombers for 30 minutes, but they were driven off, shooting down several machines. The raid somewhat delayed the advance of the German formation, so that British aviation managed to lay mines at the mouth of the Elbe River and on the approach to the Kiel Canal. One of the mines, dropped near Teschhellen, blew up Gneisenau at 7:55, which was steaming at 27 knots. The explosion occurred in front of the aft turret, as a result of which several dents were formed in the hull, some welds and plating sheets cracked. There was a loss of power, and the commander ordered the ship to be stopped. The corridor of the starboard propeller shaft was flooded, the shaft alignment was disrupted. The impact disabled some of the navigation equipment, but the guns and mechanisms were not damaged. After 30 minutes, the ship started moving at low speed. At 3:50 a.m., together with 2 destroyers, Gneisenau dropped anchor in Heligoland. Scharnhorst, though, only approached the coast of Holland by 6 p.m. At 7:16, Several bombs were dropped from a great altitude behind her stern. At 8:30, the squadron passed the island of Texel, and at 9:30, another magnetic mine exploded on the starboard side at a depth of 24 meters. The gyro compasses and lighting were out of order for 2 minutes. All turbines had to be stopped again. The left and middle ones were jammed, but the right one was almost undamaged. A large hole appeared near the aft mount of the 105mm anti-aircraft gun. 10 rooms and 4 main watertight compartments received about 300 tons of water. The fastenings of the steam pipes in the engine room on the starboard side could not withstand the impact, and due to the resulting steam leaks, the connected boilers had to be turned off. Scharnhorst had to go at 10 knots until the load was given to the starboard shaft, after which the speed was increased to 14 knots. The list of the left side, which had formed after the first explosion, leveled out, but the draft increased even more. The starboard turbine was started at 10 p.m., but the left one required repairs at the shipyard. On 13th February, Vice Admiral Ciliax again transferred the flag to Scharnhorst. In the afternoon, the ship arrived in Wilhelmshaven, where she was put into the dock for an inspection of the hull. It turned out that the damage was not so serious that the ship could be kept in the Wilhelmshaven shipyard for long, which was too close to the British air bases and was subject to frequent raids. Therefore, the ship moved to Kiel to repair the damage. The breakthrough was successfully completed. The success of the breakthrough was largely due to the cooperation with the Luftwaffe, which allocated 252 fighters for air cover. This was one of the few cases when the German fleet and air force worked so well together, and the British also felt it, losing more than 40 aircrafts in raids on the Brest squadron. During the night of 12th to 13th February, British pilots made more than 740 sorties, with no results.